Welcome, everybody. I'm Brian O'Leary, the Executive Director with the Book Industry Study Group, and happy to introduce today's session on forecasting in a time of uncertainty. Our presenters are actually pretty well known to many folks who join these calls. Gary Jones is probably going to get a frequent speaker pass pretty soon, if not with this session. He joined 3 sessions in February, March, and April of this year, and also spoke at our annual meeting with Kathy on the topic of forecasting and kind of the model that he was helpful in both developing and explaining to us and to the industry. Kathy Felgar is a frequent participant in our supply chain calls as well as on our supply chain committee. And Kathy has been working with Gary, not just to prepare this session, but also on the conversation that they started at the annual meeting, both of which have been are going to be ably moderated by Ken Brooks of Amplify Education. Ken is chair of our supply chain committee and here today to kind of keep everybody going. You're welcome to put comments, questions, observations in the chat. Ken will kind of collect those. Gary and Kathy are going to speak for, you're thinking, a little bit longer than usual, maybe 20 to 30 minutes.
Yes.
You're nodding.
Yes.
And so after that time, we'll come back to the questions, but we'll certainly have plenty of time for the conversation around it. So as things occur to you or things that are top of mind, put them in the chat. Ken and I will keep good close track of them, and we'll come back to them after the presentation. So with that, I'm going to stop and turn things over to Gary and Kathy.
Very good. Gary, you ready to go? Kathy?
We're ready. It says I am unable to share my screen. It says disabled, host disabled, participant sharing. So Brian,
yeah, you should be good now. I think you just beat me by a minute.
Oh, okay. So if I did this correctly, you should see a PowerPoint slide right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And thanks, Brian. I think instead of the frequent speaker award, I might get the enough already award. So people might be tired of hearing me talk. So I apologize. Our goal today was to provide a recap of some of the concepts that we discussed in the annual conference earlier this year for those people that were unable to attend, but not bore you with a repeat. We wanted to tie it into what that means with regards to a lot of things that we all face today, which is that uncertainty of all kinds of events and activities outside of our control that have a dramatic effect on how we plan our business and how effective we have. So I'm hoping you'll see a little bit of old and a little bit of new, but in a new context. And again, our goal today was not to do the presentation of the exact how or the cookbook on what to do, but to stimulate the collaboration and discussion here of everybody. So we want to make sure that it's very interactive. So as Brian said, please feel free to chime in. Our goal is to make sure that we have the right products in the right place at the right time at the lowest possible cost to fulfill our customer demand. And if I have tremendous certainty in my business, then this is a task that is achievable as I try to balance the competing trade-offs or expectations and goals of optimizing my service to my customers, minimizing my capital investment, and minimizing the cost that it takes to actually manage things through my entire supply chain. When I'm able to do this, I'm able to fulfill my customer service goals. My on-time and in full service goals meet my objectives, whatever those objectives might be. And again, as we've talked in the past, it may not be profitable or efficient to try to be all things to all people, but whatever goals you set, I can achieve that. On the cost side, I can take advantage of low-cost sources of supply. I have the lead time, I have the advanced knowledge, I have the insights to let me take advantage of those kind of things. From a manufacturing perspective, I can achieve my manufacturing efficiencies in terms of sequencing and level loading my capacity and capacity optimization, minimizing my changeovers, economic order quantities, a lot of those kind of things, when I have enough advance notice and a lot of certainty in my business. And then I can keep my expediting cost to a minimum. So I don't have to worry about playing catch up or reacting, I can just perform to the plan with great certainty. On the inventory or the capital side, my investments in my inventory can be optimized, meaning I won't have a lot of excess or obsolete inventory as a result of bad planning or uncertainty. And I can optimize my manufacturing capacity utilization so the return on my invested capital is at a high. All that sounds great, except in the real world, certainty is really just kind of a dream that we all have. We'd love to have that great certainty because we all know how to do our jobs and plan inventory, meet customer demands, and optimize my costs when there's no volatility or surprises. The certainty can be categorized in two different ways. One we call normal cause uncertainty. Some examples of these are just the fluctuations that we have day to day, week to week, month to month in our demand transactions. So they follow a pattern, they can follow a predictable trend, seasonality curve, new product introduction curve, some sort of expectation with some degree of volatility or fluctuation around that, but that's normal cause variation. We see that a lot in manufacturing when I look at process control limits and performance of my manufacturing operations and the production outputs. I also have normal cause variability in my supply lead times. Sometimes things are a little early, a little late, but nothing dramatic that causes significant disruption to my business. If we can measure this normal cause uncertainty, then there are standard processes that we can use within supply chain planning to make sure those are accounted for and do not disrupt our business. Some examples of these, and we're not going to cover all these here today, we've talked about some of these in the past, would be my inventory safety stock planning. Safety stock is there for just in case inventory to help us plan for and not be impacted by that normal cause variability in the demand, the supply that we've talked about. My replenishment planning. I can set my plans in the timing of those replenishments and the quantities and the sources of supply as long as I incorporate or plan for that normal cause uncertainty. Similarly, from a manufacturing perspective, I can incorporate this degrees of variation into my production planning and scheduling process. So this normal cause uncertainty, as long as we are aware of it and measure it, it's easy to adapt and embrace into our supply chain planning processes. The real challenges are what we call the special cause uncertainty. These are those outliers, as was outlined in the introduction or the overview of this presentation. Things might be things like a wood pile fire at one of the paper mills. It could be the congestion of the ports where I've got my product, I've ordered it on time, and with the congestion, it's limited or constrained the timing in which that becomes available. With the extreme heat that we've all been experiencing, it has created some disruption in our infrastructure, whether it be the roads, the railroad system, creating some delays, perhaps some rerouting. And then certainly the recent issues that we've wrestled with or been faced with regarding the reliability or predictability, or certainly the certainty of our logistics network, whether it be threat of a strike or the actual shutdown of operations of a major carrier. These are those major events that really throw a wrench into the planning processes and the supply chain productivity that we have as we anticipate or plan for normal cause uncertainty. Sometimes, if we're doing our business planning processes, we can't anticipate the occurrence of some of these events. We know when it's going to get hot. We know when it's going to get cold. There are things we can watch to keep an eye on and monitor performance in our industries. But sometimes they just show up and catch us completely off guard. When we do anticipate some of these events, sometimes we have the ability to quantify the likely impact of those events. Maybe we can anticipate the effect on lead time. We can anticipate the effect on quality. But sometimes we're very wrong on those. And sometimes the events still just that we did anticipate just don't happen. They don't materialize like we thought. And so we may have planned for something that didn't occur, and now we have to suffer the consequences of over anticipating. Managing this special cause variation really has a dramatic impact on our overall business performance. And therefore, that's what we wanted to talk about in today's discussion. So before I go on, does anybody have any questions or comments or issues that want to make sure we cover as we go through this? All right, I will keep going then. One of the key initiatives that we can use, and thus the topic of our discussion here, is forecasting in these times of uncertainty or trying to manage a special cause variation. And so I wanted to put my personal spin on it. We talk about forecasting. To me, it's nothing more than a better word to say guessing. We can't have a department of guessing, so we call it a forecasting department. We don't have a guessing process. We call it a forecasting process. But at the end of the day, all it is a process, a tool, a methodology that allows us to take our best guess as to what we think future demand or performance in our supply chain looks like. Now, whether that's done manually by somebody just providing a number, whether that's done through a process of collaboration, whether that's done through some sort of mathematical or optimization tools, all of these forecasts are still just based on a series of assumptions and inputs into that process and the way that they're actually interpreted. Some of the advanced forecasting tools on the market today will build several different models based on different interpretations of the data and different assumptions. None of them are necessarily right. They're just trying to figure out, how do we get the best guess or the best forecast that we possibly can. So I will tell you that there's no silver bullet to this process. There's no single process, there's no single method, there's no single algorithm, there's no single software tool that will ever give you that perfect forecast. So what we propose is taking multiple perspectives, using multiple techniques, taking multiple methods, and looking at all the different inputs, the assumptions, and the guesses, if you will, and look at those and understand why they've come up with their estimates and try to take the best of the best to come up with a consensus or a collaborative or a single forecast. But the key to this success is understanding the assumptions behind that forecast. If I were to provide you a forecast and a number, and I don't tell you how I got there, why I got there, what assumptions were in my forecast, chances are you're not going to trust my forecast and you're likely to put together your own forecast for your own purposes. So it is very important that we document and communicate those assumptions, and then use those assumptions as a basis to understand what we got right, what we got wrong, and why, so that we now know how we can digest that next forecast that I provide to you. And then collectively, we can work to continuously improve that forecast. So what I've proposed here is a simple 5-step approach to what we just talked about, where we want to collect multiple forecasts, multiple guesses, multiple sets of assumptions from a variety of sources. Those could be our customers, those could be our suppliers, those could be different departments within our own business that looks at our business from through a different functional lens, all of which have different sets of assumptions and interpretations of the inputs. So we want to collect those inputs. We want to document those assumptions and the rationale behind the numbers that are generated. And then we want to blend all of those different forecast perspectives together into a single forecast. Now, I've put a very small statement at the bottom of this lower right green box that says based on quality of that input. So how do we measure the quality of that input? This is that post-mortem that we need to do as reality starts to occur. So as time progresses and our actual demand or our actual events occur, we can compare them to each of those forecast perspectives and understand, did the assumptions that went into those forecasts materialize? Were they right or were they wrong? Maybe they were right and the magnitude was wrong. Maybe they were right in many ways, and we want to learn from that. So we want to take all of those forecasts, we blend them together, We want to track the performance against each of those forecasts as well as our composite forecast. And from that, learn and refine our forecasting process so that as we repeat the cycle, the next forecast input that we provide continues to get better and better and better. Thus, the quality of each input improves and the significance that it has in my development of that composite forecast also improves. I'm not going to go through this model. I just wanted to bring it back up as one of the graphics that we had talked about in one of the earlier brown bag series. This is simply an example of an Excel-based tool, and there are other tools that are not Excel-based that perform the similar kind of process, where I will take a whole variety of inputs. Now, on the left-hand side of this would be a historical mathematical-based approach, where maybe I interpret my historical demand, I look at trends, I look at seasonality, and I let mathematical tools, algorithms generate that forecast. I also want to bring in different forecasts from different perspectives, whether they be, again, my customers, my suppliers, my different functional departments. And one technique that we use is to provide a weighting to each one of those inputs based on the quality of their forecast. That statistical forecast might be highly reliable, and I might give it the highest weighting possible to say this forecast will play a significant role in the blending of these inputs. My customer forecast, they have a bias that they would like to make sure I always have plenty of stock on hand. So they're likely to give me an over-aggressive forecast. So I want to take the bias out of that forecast before I incorporate that into my decision-making. I might have other parts of my business where I tend to be conservative because I want to minimize my investment in people, processes, technology, or working capital. And so there might be a lower forecast, or I might be setting lower expectations to make sure that I can at least meet or exceed those numbers. As I understand the bias and the accuracy of those numbers, then I can figure out how I want to weight them and blend them together. So in this example, and I know there's a lot of lines on here, that the pink line with the circles would be that blending of that forecast. And this is what we would use as the input into our supply chain planning processes. But going back to that process overview or the flow that we talked about, I want to look at how did each of these other forecast inputs perform relative to the assumptions or the interpretations of the data they had, as well as the numeric value of that, because that might change my weighting of that forecast input the next time I go through that process. Once I have a forecast, sorry, my keyboard didn't work here. A second tactic that we can use, in addition to trying to find the best forecast possible, is actually run various business scenarios. And what we want to do here is we want to run a lot of what if analysis. So there are those things that we cannot necessarily anticipate, but I want to understand what might happen if any of these events materialize to the magnitude that I'm guessing. So in this example, and for those of you that have heard me talk before, we call this a triple play chart. Our triple play chart shows our forecasted demand, which is a blue line down here across the bottom, looking forward into the future. The green area in the background is the inventory that I have on hand to fulfill the demand of that forecast. And in this case, the vertical yellow bars, I realize is very hard to see, or the red lines represent either actual or planned receipts of inventory. So the triple play being demand, supply, and the net effect on inventory. And what we can do is we can set statistical inventory targets or safety stocks, which is represented by this dotted line, that fluctuate with my forecast moving forward. And I can project what might happen in the future under this particular forecast scenario that we have. I can show what my inventory will be based on the scheduled receipts. And then with planning processes, I can say, I'm going to try to plan my inventory to this pink safety stock line by receiving additional receipts as represented by these red lines. In this case, these replenishments are based on economic order quantities from the low cost source of supply. And as you can see, they're spread out. So they facilitate a level loading of capacity in the supply chain, whether that be my suppliers, the printers or manufacturers, or even my logistics network. This gives me an idea of what my point of reference or baseline is with that consensus forecast we just talked about. Then I can run some scenarios and using the forecasting as an example, what if my forecast were to drop by 50%? And so what you see on the left-hand side, I still have those scheduled receipts come in. I'm going to have a much larger buildup of inventory should that demand not come in at that forecast. And my first receipt gets pushed way out closer to the end of my time horizon here as I bleed off and deplete that inventory. I still can take advantage of the economic order quantities, but I might choose to take a different tactic if I want. On the other hand, if my demand were to come in at 200% of that forecast, you'll see I'm going to run out of stock. So I'm projected to run out of stock before my first scheduled receipt comes in. I will then get my 2 scheduled receipts, but because of my long lead time, I'm just barely going to get my next very large order in time before I run out of stock yet again. And you can also see that I will need a much higher consistent level or investment of inventory to meet that demand. So in this particular scenario, I can run different business situations to see what is the financial impact from a cost perspective for replenishment, from a working capital perspective in terms of my inventory investment, and from a service perspective in terms of having the stock available to meet my needs. This is simply one example just by fluctuating my forecast from an overall percentage, but we can throw or run scenarios for a number of other events that you might want to evaluate. I could look at the effect of a promotional activity. I could possibly look at the effect of increasing lead times on my suppliers. I could look at increased volatility in that lead time or output from my suppliers. So using this kind of concept, I can evaluate the financial impact and then make a decision on how I want to bias my planning activities. I have one more example, and then I promise I'll stop talking. And this is one that, again, a lot of you will have seen in our prior discussions, but I want to spend a little more time talking about it today in the context of scenario planning for special cause events. At a very, very high level, I have a forecast, and I'm now making a print decision or a purchase decision. I can choose to buy exactly to that forecast as we illustrated in the diagram above. And then when the demand actually comes in, I will either be right on track with my forecast, which will be right in the center of my graph. But if my demand comes in softer than I forecasted, I'll be in this left-hand side of this chart where I've actually over-ordered. And by over-ordering, I'm going to suffer the effects of carrying extra inventory. I've suffered the effects of buying more product than I need. And then I run the risk or suffer the impacts associated with getting rid of that excess and obsolete inventory, whether it's a disposal cost, a markdown, some sort of discount that I have to do to get rid of that inventory. On the flip side, if I underorder, so demand comes in a lot better than I forecasted, I then have to go back. I'm going to still have inventory carrying costs, but I didn't buy as much as I possibly could have or should have. So I'm going to lose some of those economies of scale, and I'm going to have to go back and make an additional purchase. So my average purchase cost across 2 purchases is likely much higher than if I would have bought it all at one time. And then I do have some impacts or implications associated with being out of stock. So I certainly have the goodwill with my customer and just the overall satisfaction from a service perspective. but I might actually incur some permanent or temporary revenue loss. And I may incur some incremental costs to recover from that out of stock, whether it be to expedite the supply when it does come in, or expedite supply and the fulfillment of the demand to meet that customer demand. So in this particular grid, all we're trying to show is I'm going to run a number of scenarios where I will, as outlined on the y-axis, I may choose to buy more or less than the forecast. And then eventually on the x-axis, demand will come in above or below or right on the forecast. And if I evaluate all of these implications, I could put a dollar amount in each one of these boxes to help me with my scenario planning. And I wanted to set that up before I go to this last slide here. It is a bit of an eye chart and I apologize. But over on the left-hand side is an example where we calculated the effects or the implications of those parameters we just talked about. The red areas show the worst case scenarios, or those that had the most negative effect on my business. The green shaded boxes show the most positive scenarios. And if we weave in that forecast accuracy metric that we talked about early to come up with a probability of occurrence, we can build this final graph off to the right, which lets me look at the trade-offs of, in this case, because we're talking about making that first purchase, the trade-offs of buying too much or too little. And in this case, and I apologize, the x-axis works backwards. The left-hand side of this x-axis is buying higher than I actually sell, and to the right is buying less. And you see the penalties of buying too little far exceed the penalties of buying too much. So it's in my favor in this particular case to err on the side of buying a little bit higher than I normally would, or buying higher than the forecast. It's not telling us that that's the perfect number to buy, because we still have uncertainty in our business, but it does give us a way that we can run different scenarios and understand the effects of those potential outcomes so that we can make better business decisions rather than just relying on those guesses that are undocumented. So I apologize for the long spiel. Brian, I think I got us in right here at the half-hour mark. And so I'd like to open it up for questions. And I apologize, I haven't seen any of the comments come in.
There's been a pretty active discussion going on in the in chat here, but let me just remind everyone, as you have questions, drop them in there and I'll integrate them into the conversation. So one topic that seems to be popular in the right over here, or in the chat, is it more important to forecast correctly or to be flexible in response to the forecast?
I am of the opinion that the forecast, and I've been told this for a long time, are either going to be lucky or lousy, and I just never know which it's going to be at any point in time. So to me, understanding and being able to quickly react to the need to change that forecast will be the most important thing out of those two.
I agree. I was going to say, given that forecasting is so difficult, you have to be able to be flexible in order to compensate for the unpredictable, for sure.
And the other one that is a kind of an interesting debate is in dealing with the variances that, or the variation that we've seen in supply lead times. I know a lot of publishers, including Amplify, ended up buying a lot of stock in response to that. I'm detecting, though, from your chart there, though, that increasing the quantity is not the right move, but maybe changing the frequency with which that quantity is ordered is the right move. Any thoughts about that?
What we found, Ken, in looking at some scales from some suppliers, is there are some breakpoints where too small of a replenishment quantity that is bought very frequently helps me keep my inventory very, very low, reduces my risk of excess and obsolete. However, the unit costs associated with those small replenishment quantities exceeded it was high enough that it made more sense in some cases to buy too much and dispose of it.
I'll add that in general, we're moving in the direction you're indicating, Ken, which is ordering smaller quantity to begin with and being able to reprint very quickly. That's only possible because the conditions have improved in the marketplace for that right now, though.
So Matt Cannell was talking here about having the ability or printers having the ability to change their quantities. But I'm trying to get at, is that changing of quantities more desirable to a publisher or moving the print quantity in and out? Or is it both? I mean, do we have a sense of that?
What do you mean by moving the print quantity in and out?
So instead of ordering printing for March, we order one for being able to push that planned printing from March out to June or pull it in up to February, as opposed to increasing it from 15,000 to 20,000 or down to 10,000, still in that March timeframe.
Yeah, PUP has not done a lot of that kind of speculation, I guess you'd call it.
Gary, any thoughts?
Yeah, so Ken, I certainly live in a world of just-in-time replenishment. So I've grown up in environments where you want to do buy one, sell, or sell one, buy one, and keep your replenishment small and frequent. It really comes down to actually doing some of the analysis, which led us to this diagram, which has kind of that diagonal analysis on it, where we do want to look at both the purchase costs, the storage cost, and the obsolescence cost. As far as the pushing and pulling, there really needs to be a collaborative relationship with your suppliers, because while it benefits the customer in that scenario to optimize their inventory, it drives and runs the risk of driving a lot of inefficiency into manufacturing processes, certainly from a capacity planning and level loading perspective. If something gets pulled out of my schedule, I now have a hole in that schedule or excess untapped capacity as my risk, perhaps deferring that order into a capacity constrained situation. So again, from a buyer of product, that's absolutely ideal. From a supplier of that scenario, it can introduce some challenges and incremental costs.
One of the first things that came up in chat was when you showed the cost, assets, and service triad there.
Yes.
Was the ESG, environmental, social, and governance impact, primarily environmental. Would that end up being like a fourth circle on there, or is that somehow incorporated in the other three?
I certainly think it can be, because that adds another dimension of competing decision making. So the best decision I might make from a cost perspective may not be the best decision from a compliance or ESG perspective. So it certainly would add another dimension to the thinking. One of the things we did try to build into that diagonal analysis for the order quantity was a little bit of thinking around carbon footprint and green thinking into that, to the extent that we can quantify the cost implications of that.
Yeah, it seems that since so much of the impact has to do with where the power and where the energy comes from,
yeah,
that it's going to have an impact on the sourcing decision for sure. Is it nearby in the Northeast, or is it, far off in some place that's hydroelectric, low impact energy? Seems like that would be an independent kind of overlay.
Yeah. So using your example, far away, low impact, drives up inventory investment because I have to manage to a longer lead time with greater volatility or variability in that demand or in that supply. So a great example of competing trade-offs to make a holistic business decision.
Javen is asking a pretty interesting question here about, is there a difference in methodology when there's a healthy, predictable, repeat customer business, maybe with new products? Or is it, if everything is new, like new customers, same products, does that change how you think about things?
It does. The newer products, the newer customers, the newer markets that you get into, you don't have the history, you don't have the insights that you would in a more stable or a longer term relationship kind of situation. So you don't have the track record of having those assumptions and measuring the performance or quality of those relationships in the forecasts.
Yeah, it would seem like kind of the lumpiness of new products and the lumpiness of new customers might be able to be treated similarly, but that I've never seen anybody talk about that.
I think one of the other things that we've seen, Ken, is that given the kind of the business dynamics that we all face today, even in those existing products, existing markets, or existing customers, the dynamics are changing quite a bit. So buying behaviors are different. Buying behaviors and preferences change much more rapidly. Kathy, I think you can comment on this. I think some of the advanced notice in lead time or the communications that we're getting from our customers is continuing to shorten to the point where we don't have as much time to sense and respond.
Absolutely. We've seen that one of our largest customers is now not placing orders until 5 weeks before pub date. And of course, we have to order much further in advance than that. So it's tricky.
So Dave asked a question about the choice of a time slice in the forecast. So days, weeks, months versus quarters, kind of the trade-off in accuracy, and how do you match the time slice of your planning to the realities of your supply chain?
So I'll give you, and that's a fantastic question, because it's very easy to fall into a tendency to kind of look at a time bucket, let's just say weeks as an example, and measure my forecast accuracy of guessing that week. And I'm never going to be able to do it. And so I'll give you a different example. I did some work for a school product supplier. We didn't care about the volatility of the forecast week to week, month to month. The thing that was the most important was understanding the total forecasted volume for that back to school season. And so as long as we had that total quantity right, and we knew when it was going to start, that allowed me to plan all of my activities earlier in the year to make sure I had the proper buildup of inventory, the proper planning for warehousing and distribution capacity, the proper flexibility to change mix as I needed. And so I didn't care so much about daily forecasts, weekly forecasts, monthly forecast. In that case, it truly was around my peak season forecast. I have other environments where I really want to tighten all of my lead times in terms of both the supply and the demand fulfillment. And so that's where I do care about the week to week, because I'm going to try to run just in time or hand to mouth, if you will. And I have to plan in much smaller time increments.
If I can just comment to bring it a bit more back into the world of publishing. So not that isn't a good example, Carrie, it was, but so at PUP, we have a number of different book types, we call them. We have trade, academic trade, textbooks, monographs, and we expect each category to behave somewhat differently, and they generally do. So trade has a more rapid spike and fall off generally. Academic trade, or books that are adopted in courses, tend to be more steady sellers, and textbooks, as I'm sure you can speak to, Ken, has a very slow buildup, but then a big demand for a few years before it gradually falls off and gets replaced by a new edition. So all that has to be taken into consideration. I don't know where you work, Dave, but you might have some of those factors.
Yeah, that was Dave's question. Should we use different forecasting approaches for different types of books and different demand patterns? Seem to.
I absolutely think you should.
Just scanning through the notes here.
I mean, while you're scanning, I will add trade for PUP is the most volatile and unpredictable. And we do try to take into consideration things like if we're expecting publicity in major media outlets, if we're planning an author tour and so on, but if there isn't an exact correlation between that and sales. Always.
Still scanning. Anybody else have any other questions here while I'm looking through this? Or have I missed one in the chat?
I'll go back and take a second look in a minute. I was going to add, Ken, while you're looking, that it feels to me like the forecasting piece and the feedback loop that Gary spent a fair amount of time talking about in February, March, and April plays a much larger role for trade lists and front lists because the accuracy of your ability to predict plays a much larger role than anything else. In effect, if you're always over forecasting or under forecasting, knowing that that's your tendency, can only come about by going back and checking on it. And I think, Kathy, you've said one of the things that you have trouble with is just getting the time and staff to kind of do that back checking.
Yes, we are starting to do what we call birthday reports, looking at books roughly a year to 18 months after pub date to then go back and see, did they behave as we expected? What happened? Did we need to reprint, right off the bat, and try to feed that information back into our forecasting going forward?
Yeah, but are you finding it time consuming?
We're in the initial stages. It is kind of time consuming right now. And of course, PUP doesn't have demand planning department or business analysts who have time to study all this like some bigger publishers, but it's still a good exercise.
When Gary and Kathy, this sounds like a real similar discussion to what you were talking about early on in the presentation, where you've got forecasts from different perspectives and you're going to combine them, like discounting them differentially based on the quality, the historical quality. So you got the feedback loop for improving each component, but then you've also got, well, here's sales. They always either under or over forecast depending on their compensation. Finance does XYZ, marketing XYZ, and editorial probably plans high. So you somehow discount those component forecasts to come up with the integrated forecast?
I would say we do try to do that. We haven't come up with a scientific method for doing it, but there's certainly trends along the lines you're describing that I try to take into account.
Can we look at two different factors as we blend those together? One is the general bias tendency. So if certain inputs tend to always be high or always be low, I don't know if this is a word or not, but what we do is we'll debias that forecast. So try to take that bias out so that it becomes kind of a normalized forecast. The second thing we'll look at is just the forecast error of that forecast, and that'll give us an indication of what that accuracy is. That is at least our leading contributor to how we would weight those forecasts. So to oversimplify it, we would give each input a percent that adds up to 100%, and we blend those together. A couple of key factors about that, as we go through time, not just because of the quality of the forecast, but based on the nature of the source of the input, those forecasts may have different levels of significance or accuracy as I go through a season. So if I'm going through the life cycle of a book, my sales input and my historical demand certainly plays a much bigger role. If I'm early on, a comparative title or initial feedback from sales and marketing might have a more significant role. So as I go through that life cycle, how I blend those inputs based on the source can change, in addition to the quality and the accuracy. Another thing to think about is what I'm actually using that forecast for. So again, early in the journey, I'm using that forecast to help me plan at a very macro level. I want to plan my paper requirements. I want to plan my print capacity requirements. As I go closer and closer to print time, then I get closer to needing to know specific print quantities of specific ISBNs, perhaps time phased, where I'm going to distribute those. So back to Dave's question about the granularity or the timing, I'm planning my paper and some of my capacity in a much larger bucket than I plan my near-term print and distribution requirements.
One other topic, and this is actually from your last slide. I've seen publishers spend a lot of time looking at, like, what is our expected demand, and then what is the high case and what is the low case. And typically, I think when you look at inventory management, you're coming up with the one number, here's the planned forecast, and you do a safety stock on that. How does inventory planning and inventory and demand planning vary when you're looking at those different scenarios? Do you do them both for each, or how do you think about it?
I'd like to be able to look at different scenarios. And as I look at my middle of the road case, I'm more likely to have a plus and minus variation that I need to account for in safety stock. If I'm looking at my high case, there probably is very little probability of upside above and beyond my high case. Therefore, my need for safety stock on the high case side is virtually zero. On my low case side, then I need to plan for a lot more safety stock, because if the forecast is going to be wrong, it's most likely going to be above and beyond that low case. So whether I'm planning a high case, middle of the road, or low case changes my safety stock calculations.
Can I just add to that we would build in more safety stock in a situation where we're printing overseas and it takes a long time to supply, as opposed to where we're printing locally and have a short time to supply.
Would you ever use print on demand or short run printing in place of safety stock?
Yes, absolutely. We do we have a program called POD Gap. We've set up titles, front list titles in a POD with POD vendors, just in case it sells way better out of the gate than anticipated. But we don't do that with 4-color books on coated paper.
That's all overseas and reprint overseas.
Right now it is. I'm starting to try to find more suppliers locally to do that kind of work. But our particular lists, nature and art, history and architecture, very high production values. So
let me introduce you to Matt Cannell. You guys can talk after that.
I think we've met. Hi, Matt.
Good to see you.
Other questions?
There's an interesting conversation that's broken out over Kathy's description of their birthday analyses. Kathy, I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about that, particularly with the what you're learning as you try to delve into why something might have been higher or low.
Sure. We've had one round so far, and we've had people from every department comment on the books. We've chosen books that are a mix of book types that I mentioned, and discuss them 12 to 18 months later, and people from every department comment on their experience of the book, and including the sales reps. So we have some feedback around whether or not a cover design really worked in the marketplace, whether the title worked, whether the author was available for book tours. And we found that it can be hard to trace those factors back into sales. You know, if one bookstore owner said they didn't like the cover, does that really mean that was a factor? It's hard to know. Is that?
So,
Go ahead.
okay, sorry,
You go ahead.
I was going to ask another question, but if you got more to say on that, go for it.
Well, we're planning to do more, and we're definitely delving into the quantitative aspects of it. That is, did we print the right number? Did we print in the right place? You know, how did it compare, not only in terms of units sold, but also margin performance?
Is social media of any use at all in determining like what the forecasts are, or is that the wrong time scale entirely?
I'm probably not the best person to ask that. I don't have a lot of expertise in digital marketing, but from what I've heard, Book Talk can be a pretty big influence in the trade area.
But my question about that would be, is it like that happens and bang, you're swamped, or can it be tied into your forecasting somehow with enough lead time to do something about it?
Good question. We would need to have somebody from my digital marketing department on, and who's looking at the sales results. I guess it's like a real-time promotion, right?
Exactly. Yeah, maybe that's one of those things that you have to take out of your history to get what the true trend is, and then hope for more of it when it comes down to it. So what's the fastest way for somebody to get started with forecasting and inventory management? Let's say that they're presenting this to editorial team or sales team or finance, and they just want to get a pilot program going. How do you do it?
So I think one of the traps that people can fall into is try to do forecasting for all their items. I've been places where a demand planning review, you start with the items from A to Z, and it's a 3-hour meeting that turns into a 2-day meeting. And the quality of the inputs just completely erode from there. So if you're starting out brand new, I think it's focus on those important titles that are really going to make or break your performance, whether it's the launch of several new books and we want to make sure we try to get it right, or there's some really key items important to your business. The intent here would be to capture as many different inputs as possible and document those assumptions. By documenting those assumptions, it lets you go into and have discussions that Kathy talked about with regards to the birthday meetings. So the only way we're going to improve our forecast is to understand why we forecasted what we did, do that post-mortem to find out what worked, what didn't, what we got right, what we didn't. So document the assumptions, document the inputs, and try to come up with a consensus forecast, whether it's through a mathematical tool or everybody around the table agreeing to it. From an inventory planning perspective, there are a lot of tools out there online, a lot of equations. Safety stock is there to be the buffer against volatility of demand and supply. The better you understand how predictable or how accurate that forecast is, the better you can plan your safety stock. The better I am aware of my supply variability, also does the same kind of thing from a safety stock planning. The second thing would be to understand those economics that get close to, and I don't like to talk about economic order quantities and being an absolute answer, but a directional tendency to understand, should I take the strategy that was discussed earlier of small quantities very, very frequently, or large quantities that capitalize on economies of scale, but take a long lead time and put me at risk for excess inventory. So from an inventory planning perspective, you want to look at your cycle stock, which is a function of your economic order quantity, and your safety stock, which is the certainty of supply and demand.
So back in that EOQ formulation, I know you can't really apply it in publishing because all the assumptions underlying it are pretty much violated. But when you do that, do you think of like the fixed manufacturing cost, the make ready, as part of the per order cost, unit cost? And how do you treat obsolescence? Is that something after the fact, or does that go into the calculation?
Go ahead, Kathy.
I was going to say, I think it should be included. We should be total cost of ownership. A lot of publishers are not in that model yet. And I think it also, in my experience, it varies one publisher to the next, whether people amortize pre-press or write it off on the first printing.
And obsolescence is kind of already baked in once you make the decision, so it's not really a separate factor in the EOQ.
It should be. That got at a question somebody else posted about factoring in returns, which we weren't able to get to, but I know it has happened in the publishing world that the reprint hits the same time the returns hit. So that's something to be avoided whenever possible.
Very good. All right, well, we're just about out of time here. I really do appreciate Gary, you and Kathy participating this way and coming up and challenging us with all this new thinking. So very much appreciate it. Brian, any final words? You're on mute.
I wanted to thank Gary and Kathy, as you have, for making the time and kind of recapping some of the things they talked about in April. But I also wanted to point out that we're releasing a survey out of the supply chain committee tomorrow that solicits publisher input on plans for sourcing for fall lists. So if you're interested in responding, the link to that survey is in the agenda. So you'll have a first bite at the apple before we announce it tomorrow.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank
All right. Thanks, everyone. It's good seeing you. Have a great afternoon.
Brian, quick question for you.
Sure.
With regards to the supply chain meeting tomorrow, does that include the barcode working group, or do we have a separate meeting scheduled for that?
We don't have one scheduled, but it does need to be. You can. I don't think we'll talk about it. I'm sorry. The supply chain committee is not meeting until a week from 2 weeks from today. But we can put that on the agenda. But it's I haven't written the agenda for that meeting yet.
Okay.
But the meeting tomorrow is an announcement of the new survey. It'll be in the newsletter. I also need to follow up with you on the things we talked about at the end of the meeting.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I'll look forward to your email then.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye, everybody.
Hi, nicely done.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks. I'm trying to figure out how to save the chat. There you are. Okay.